Welcome back to those. This session is going to be slightly more relaxed. The first hour was very hectic. And thanks for the sharing and the listening. We're going to get into workshop mode and we need to kind of think of certain norms for speaking and reflecting. We're going to get to that in a second. So the agenda for this 1 hour is that we break out into 4 POC groups and 4 white ally groups. These are the discussion leaders. They already know the questions. We'll put the questions in chat as well for each of the groups. Separate questions, but separate but similar questions for the POC groups and the white ally groups. And the leaders, discussion leaders are going to assign a note taker in their group. And we also have slides in which to take notes. These are going to be safe spaces for reflection and constructive criticism. So if there are notes you do not want to put down in your slides, feel free not to do that and have a confidential conversation. So 15 minutes for the breakout groups, and please bear with us while we put you into the right breakout groups. It might take a couple of minutes here and there, and we'll adjust the time accordingly. And then we come into the report back session. Each discussion leader reports back from their group. You have 1 to maximum of 2 minutes to report back, and we have 20 minutes overall for that session, and hopefully 10 minutes for any questions. And then Jess is going to finish by recapping and reviewing and talking about next steps in the last 5 minutes. Next slide. So thanks to the Pacific Climate Warriors for actually kind of sharing these guidelines in a previous tipping point retreat from which we have drawn today. So we're going to get into separate caucuses so that they can be safe spaces for reflection, and discussion leaders going to hold that space. The idea is to be able to have conversations which are sensitive at the same time. You're mindful of what you're saying and the impact it has. So what I would request discussion leaders to do is hold the space for understanding and reflection and conversations that need to be had, but do filter through in your report back anything that might be culturally sensitive or might be something that will have an impact on the broader session. So these are some of the norms that we are asking you to think about and think through while you get into the breakout groups, is to listen, to understand and honor the diversity of perspectives and backgrounds, work with imperfect language, and don't basically expect closure in all the conversations, self-disclose and maintain confidentiality if you need to. So having said that, we're now going to get into the breakout groups and see you back after that. I'm going to ask the POC discussion leaders to start reporting back, and the request, the suggestion is that white allies listen first to what the POC groups have to say. So I'm going to I'll start with our group. Fahima, you want to go first?
Okay, so the 2 questions were, what do you think is the biggest challenge to diversity within the Australian climate movement? And how can we overcome these challenges? And what is our expectation from white allies? So yeah, we talked about diverse stories needing to be told, and but also when white people tell the stories from diverse communities, you need to realize that we need to be more than points of data. So these stories need to be real and they need to come from an authentic source. One of the critique of the climate movement as a whole is that we are quite reactive and it's not grounded in deeper long-term solutions or effects. So, and we are kind of like quite obsessed about technocratic solutions, because that's sort of like in our sort of the nation's mind, that's like an easier fix, but we do need to take time to go slow into these meaningful stories and relationship buildings. We discussed the fact that justice needs to be addressed systematically. So like you've heard our stories, you've consumed our pain, but you need to sort of then, zoom out and tackle the big underlying systemic problems that is the intersection of racism and climate destruction. And yeah, we also need to broaden what environmentalism is, because I guess, yeah, people from diverse cultures approach care for the environment very differently. And the norms that we see in the climate movement is set by the dominant society. So we kind of like need to interrogate that more and understand sort of like politics that are inherent within kind of all these diverse communities. Um, and yeah, and I guess we sort of like popcorn a bit at the end about what we would like to see from white allies. And yeah, I think white allies need to figure out the solutions and not sort of just rely on sort of us telling them what the solutions are. Donate money to anti-racism organizations and programs. Be consistent in your efforts. And yeah, leadership, in terms of leadership, white people do have the power to make leaders, and sort of, yeah, elevate sort of these diverse voices more. And yeah, include people at the table without putting the burden on them entirely for solutions. And yeah, I think Divya had a really wonderful wrap up, which is intersectionality is not a concession.
Thank you so much, Fahima. I just want to kind of put a kind of certain kind of shell around these reflections that we'll be sharing, in the sense that kind of this is something I've seen in my activism work in India, and the same thing that comes up in Australia, is that there are challenges with representation of kind of us, and representation of the narratives and stories. But a lot of these challenges are also very systemic. They arise because of systemic kind of, kind of factors. And I think Divya and I had the benefit of being in this group, and Divya, who's a researcher from the climate justice researcher from the US, really put it in perspective. And this is something I see a lot as someone who's now I look at environmentalisms around the world and I try to compare the differences and similarities. So we don't have a huge environment justice movement in Australia like we do in the US. And having had that has changed maybe the narrative in the US climate movement from being purely technocratic to something that is grounded in human justice in places much more than the Australian narrative. So that's a systemic thing to think about, over and beyond factors of race and representation, which we also have to look at within that bigger problem, and that as subsets within that bigger problem. So I'm going to ask Sadia next to report back.
Thanks, Ruchira. We had a really productive discussion as well. We talked about challenges in terms of, I think I can go back to Arundhati Roy's quote, that don't simplify something that is complex and don't make something complex that is very simple. So we talked about the pressure that community, activist community, POC community face when they're like asked to represent the whole community as one person. The organizations wanting diversity in the white movement often lack that understanding that our communities are also as complex as any other community. So asking to represent the whole community as one when the system is not there to facilitate, it's very intense to represent, and it leads to more tokenization rather than actual representation. We also talked about the different layers of complexity that's managing family, managing our relationship to culture is very different across different community. So how people from POC backgrounds represent themselves and their community within the movement often face lots of difficulty. And there is also that fear of how much criticism can be done in a constructive way when the system is not very supportive to accommodate all those spaces, because this rush of we need to get through this campaign quickly, there is no time, and it has been like this for quite some time. So now that with diversity, what does diversity mean? Are we actually wanting diversity as a proper representation with autonomy, with the knowledge, or just as a token? And in terms of, I think we had lots of chats, so if someone from the group also want to jump in, if I'm missing any point, please do so. For the second one, how can we overcome this? We also discussed that rather than theoretical support that we want this amount of diversity, what practical supports are there? And we had some really good discussions about the pre-work that our white allies should do, that going into a multicultural, diverse community, how much cultural awareness training, or they need to do that, see us as a diverse community. And also we talked about that our communities have embedded knowledge and understanding of the complexity, so that provide the space so we can lead our community engagements as well. So it's not a top-down structure that just discusses that we are going to do this for South Asia. South Asia is a very complex geographical area, so we are going to save them, right? That kind of narrative needs to be challenged and stop. So let South Asia decide their narrative and incorporate that within the Australian climate movement. We also talked about financial support in terms of, and if not financial support, not available, even just logistical support in terms of providing more volunteers to support our work, because often people in these communities are doing 2-3 jobs or having multiple other engagements that they're doing it as a volunteer capacity. So how the movement can support better in terms of finance and logistics to support this kind of work that many South Asian communities are doing. Am I missing anything? Anyone want to jump in from my group?
I'll actually say that was fantastic, and we won't do jump-ins right now because we have 6 more groups to go through. But hopefully 10 minutes at the end for people to jump in. Thanks, Sadia. I think there are consistent points across the first 2 groups, but you also specifically talk about the cultural literacy, and that's a very critical kind of point to kind of remember. I'm going to now pass to Varsha.
Great, thank you. So we talked about some of the, the challenges of diversity being that, like, funding structures themselves and what it means to decolonize those spaces, because creating spaces like this do take time, they do take money, they do take resources, so finding that in itself can be so tricky. And then we also talked about what I thought was really interesting, but the nuance of South Asians themselves, and when you look at people like Rishi Sunak, who are South Asian and supposedly representing all of us, but also are they really? And the fact that we're allowed to have nuance, and we don't need to be homogenized and put into a box, and the fact that things like trauma and colonization have affected all of us, but the outcomes are different, and even looking at candidates like Diley, and the fact that we're just not all the same, and creating spaces for like-minded South Asians is also just as equally important to actually achieve climate justice, and how to actually go about that. And then we also talked about the fact that there's like a lack of organization and leadership positions in the climate movement. So again, like creating these spaces. So I think one of the analogies was the chicken and the egg. Like, how do we get in there when we don't have like the resources to get in there? But then we're not part of the movement because there's no one actually there. So kind of figuring that out. And what we said is that it's really, really important to make sure that we have spaces like this for conversation to actually understand what's not there in the first place, and to really be able to identify that and make sure that there's safety in those conversations. So I think this space, like we were talking about what actually feels safe, and people were saying this space feels safe because it feels like there's a sense of allyship, there's a sense of understanding and listening, which is not there in a lot of other spaces. So yeah, very grateful that we've got all these incredible people with us, and yeah, if I've missed anything, please feel free to jump in.
Add caste, so recognizing it also came up, recognizing our own differences, our own privileges in the movement itself, and if we're being representative, or if we're kind of not giving or navigating the spaces as either pale-skinned or upper class or upper caste or dominant caste people.
That was fantastic. Thank you. The first point about Rishi Sunak, South Asians, not all the same, values, and the last point about our own privilege, they kind of tie up together very strongly. And more as South Asians living in Australia, but also South Asians with ties back in South Asia. I work across India and Australia. It's really important for our white allies to understand the changes that are going on, understand the wedge in values in society that's occurring in South Asia, that's occurring in India, and to understand, kind of constantly learn and walk with us and understand that it's not all the same, either with cultural identity or with political affiliation and so on and so forth. And who to endorse, who to support, who to be with, and who to not be. These are very important, and also to understand that we too have our own privileges. And so there are lots of complexity to kind of understand and kind of walk with us. Thank you for that. And the last person I'm going to invite is Lavanya.
Great, thanks, Ruchira. So our group, we talked about some of the biggest challenges is the obsession with targets and 1.5 degrees. It's not a compelling enough story, and it doesn't work not only for POC, but for everyone, but specifically for POC, they're not included in that story. And yeah, it doesn't really like move people to take action or change or come together. The movement also focuses on really abstract things for a lot of people can think back like 10-15 years, and it's all about melting ice caps, which no one lives near a glacier at the like close enough to the ice caps that the scientists were talking about to really put it together. And people experts in their lives, they have seen climate impacts in like a lot of people are subsistence farming communities in India, so they those changes, like how the climate is impacting everyone, is different, and we are not touching and going to the heart of those issues and how it changes and impacts their material lives, or how do our campaigns better people's material conditions. Then also, someone mentioned that we need to talk about engagement of communities and talk about involvement or co-creation. We're not just, it's not like a subject object. We're trying to engage people. They need to be at the heart of it, which links to the funding. So a few people have mentioned this before, but if we are not going to fund POC-led climate justice campaigns, then we're not going to have that. It's not involvement, co-creation, but also leadership from the people who need to be centered. And this is because of the centralization of philanthropy and whiteness in this space. And then this is a point that's kind of like been across all the groups. The differences in political backgrounds and parents and how they approach politics is a barrier to our participation. Again, going back to the last group's point about how we are all politically different and have caste differences, class differences, and those come into play. And that is like an intersectional thing that you have to grapple with and, create space for within the South Asian or POC communities for those different and marginalized identities to be amplified. And then how do we overcome some of these challenges, and what are the expectations from white allies? Jess gave a example of our Friends of the Earth. The transport campaign is quite led led by POC, it has a lot of POC engagement, is because it kind of impacts and is relatable to their material lives, but also white organizers who have been doing the anti-racism work and talking to communities on the ground. And in those communities and building relationships then leads to more authentic connection, involvement, and not a tokenistic stepping up of POC into those leadership roles. So really getting out into the ground and in an appropriate way. And funding. And if it's not your place to be there, then funding those campaigns. And there was a really good point about POC seeing themselves as within the victim narrative and the need to shift to agency narrative. Like it is, again, often when we're like in victim narrative, we don't see our own privilege, and we don't see, like, a lot of us probably here are upper class and upper caste because that's why we're here. We need to shift away from that, but also take agency of the fact that, because if we were doing that, then the white movement is going to do that as well. So the change can also start from within. And there was a last point that I got booted out from the group for, and I didn't get to hear, but it says, don't expect perfection from POC organizers as white organizers, which is,
Fantastic. Thanks, Lavanya. I have to rush because Catherine's going to leave, and she's the discussion leader who needs to report back before that. That was fantastic. And the things about both the narrative, technocratic narratives, technical narratives don't resonate, but also about actually co-creating groups from the ground up. narratives and perspectives and stories can be generated. The two things going together. That's a very, very, very important thing to remember. Thank you. So I'm going to actually now pass to White Allies report backs. And we'll start with Catherine. I'm really sorry. I know you have to leave in like 4 minutes, but you go first.
Well, thanks so much, Ruchira. Yeah, look, our group, I suppose just first up, wanted to acknowledge the leadership of Sapna and all of you in this space. Like, the conversation really has moved along, and I think that's testament to all your work. So yeah, we talked about recognising that and also acknowledging that it hasn't translated into resourcing. And people were wanting to reflect on how to contribute more on setting up back-end resources or logistics in a way, and handing over leadership. A couple of the themes from our conversation around community that really struck with people. The conversation around slowing down to do relationships and moving at the speed of trust was something that really hit people. And the questions we were reflecting on, I should have said, are one thing that's sticking out for you that you want to do differently after this, and then thinking about how the report challenges us to frame our work for climate justice with more depth, more nuance, more complexity. What are some of the ways we can include embodied climate stories and foreground intersectionality and justice? So those were our reflection questions. So in the reflections on community, people were reflecting on times where they were perhaps a little passive when people from more diverse communities had been shut down in white spaces, and wanting to step up and be less passive and do some of the work in those spaces. And also reflecting on the amount of work it takes to create those safe spaces, and the tension between scale and relational work was a theme that we talked about. So people felt that they often would get distracted by kind of scale metrics and presenting those to funders, and that they needed to work more to bring those relational metrics and values up so that that work can slow down. And in the stories, we also talked about stories and narratives and what we can do to build compassionate values and justice narratives into the climate conversation in the long term. So we reflected on how keeping the narrative focused on technologies, it kind of suits the fossil fuel industry as well, because it really depersonalizes the real impact, and abstract targets, 1.5, I think, as Lavanya said. So a people-centered narrative can smash through that focus that makes everything abstract and far away. We reflected on the renewable superpower narrative that is in some parts of the climate movement at the moment. It's very imperialist, very dominator kind of a narrative, and something that we need to take on. And we were really struck in the report too by the stories of lived experience with all the layers and complexity, and the way that they can bring you know, the overseas experience and the Australian experience together. And I think the reflecting on Australia's global responsibility is again something that's dropped out of Australian climate narratives, because we're so focused on technology and transition, which is important, but that global responsibility narrative we have really shied away from as a movement in the last few years. And it's, I think, quite urgent to build that back up in a really comprehensive way, in a way that actually moves the public as well. So that was just like a snapshot of our group, and thank you so much for all your work in this space.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was really, really kind of good and insightful, and acknowledging, you know, kind of funding. All the conversations have moved ahead. Funding needs to kind of follow through, and the fact that there's always a challenge with pitching to funders about scale versus relationships and trust, and also the very important thing about the RE superpower question. We kind of did discuss that in the North-South intersectionality workshops that ran a couple of months ago, and maybe the thing to do is next workshop both this and that together. There's a session next Thursday, and it'll be great if people can come. The link will be sent around, where we kind of talk about the RE superpower narrative and climate justice from the Australian and Indian perspective. So thank you for that, Catherine. And if you're not going to be around, thank you for coming, and we'll see you around. I'm going to pass now to Holly.
To make it very quick, I think we had a great chat. The first kind of prompt was, like what's really resonating with you, and certainly just the gift of this report from Sapna and the work that went into it, and the labor of sharing stories in the report and today. Thank you. Incredibly helpful. I guess reflecting on the previous group, we also discussed that, like pacing, deep depth relationships, growing at the speed of trust. And also a couple of things people were reflecting on specifically. Sometimes when issues are raised, groups can have a tendency to like immediately fix or immediately propose, how it can be fixed, when actually sometimes we just need to sit with it and to listen more and more deeply. And we also talked about resourcing. Needs to be so much more. Also, that's not easy, very hard to find resourcing for just grassroots organizing, community organizing, full stop. So I think there's a big and rich conversation to happen there. And I might just pause. There's a few more notes in our slide just to keep room for other groups and people.
Thank you. Thanks, Ollie. Very consistent with what the last group said, with the sitting and listening, slowing down, and the resourcing, key points. So I'm going to now pass to Nish.
Thanks, Ruchira. And thank you to everyone who has shared their story today and been vulnerable and shared what white folks can be doing. Our group, we spoke a lot about the importance of language and decolonizing the ways in which we think. And so this included moving from centering white activists, reaching out to include and amplify BIPOC voices, to recognizing that to decolonize our minds, we need to come in behind BIPOC people and communities who are on the front lines, because we don't have the lived experiences that they do, and we need to take a step back and support from behind. And that also related to supporting BIPOC caucuses and safe spaces. So echoing what Charlie said at the start today, offering solidarity and support on their terms and not imposing any ideas or making presumptions, and really slowing down and taking the time to build those relationships. We also spoke about the importance of empathizing and the need to think more about the emotional experiences of BIPOC folks. For a lot of white folks, it's often an intellectual experience, thinking about the impacts of climate change and learning about them in classroom settings. And yeah, we need to learn to focus on them not just as abstract concepts. We also spoke about the importance of reframing narratives from how to get everyday Aussies on board environmental goals, because often that defaults to thinking about the everyday Australian as white, and that doesn't reflect reality. And we also spoke about the phrase climate activists, and it was mentioned before, like not everyone identifying as an activist, and the need to think more about what that actually means. Yeah, I'll throw it back to you, Ruchira.
Thanks, Nish. Again, very consistent, also consistent with some of the things that came up in the POC groups in terms of what we need. So it's great to hear those reflections kind of filtering through and thinking of it from the other side. I'm going to now pass to Mick.
Thanks, Ruchira. I'm just reiterating the gratitude we had for this space, and yeah, I'll do my best not to repeat things because I'm feeling lots of consistent themes in our conversation as well. But we reflected on Charlie's comments about the pace in which we work and how we prioritise the relationship building piece, having really great experiences in relationship building spaces led by people of colour with PCW and Sapna, and how slowing down and prioritising those relationships is embedded in those spaces, but often that's the first thing to go in spaces that aren't led by people of colour. So it's just like reiterating how important that is. The welcoming aspect, so when movements are at that point of explosivity, it's actually so important if you're welcomed or not, in how your experience is defined in the climate space, how deep it was and how connected you felt, and what actually becomes possible when this welcoming piece is done in a meaningful way. Reiterating the kind of oppressive structures and mentalities of like burnout, the mindset of urgency, and related to that pacing, but further entrenches those oppressive structures that we say we're here to dismantle. But then on the other hand, thinking about solidarity mindsets, asking who is the us, showing up to build relationships and holding the both end that we all agree on, but how can we slow down and contemplate and be more intentional whilst, with these constant reminders of social media, being in a crisis, how do we hold these two things in tension? And then just looking a bit into organising and mobilising lens. We often conflate the latter with the former, but good, deep, relational focused organising would really help us if we were oriented towards that, and it was less about this scaling, trying to match the scale of the crisis. And it's really quickly what ways we can include and embody climate stories. So thinking about who are the messengers. So white, it's blinding was a comment that was made, which really resonated. It really needs an overhaul. Like, we're still seeing these oppressive systems as root of the problem, and the same habits are still showing up. More space for learning. Our messages are way too manicured, and different approaches to strategy. I think Lavanya mentioned this earlier, but deeply involving folks in the creation of the strategy, not in a tokenistic way, but while folks from marginalised communities want to be a messenger for a strategy that they don't believe in. And I'll just leave it there.
Thanks so much for that. That also kind of both Nish and Nick, your group, I think quite a few of the points grapple with the problems that we grapple with in the POC caucuses, but from the other side. It's kind of great to hear those reflections as well. And the cultural literacy, the need for cultural literacy, recognizing the need for it as white activists, campaigners, allies going into a space or trying to understand a space that you're going to work in. Very, very, very critical. So my colleague Jess tells me that I could do a wrap up, and we only have 2 minutes left. So here's my suggestion. No one's had a chance to come off and say anything, including our own kind of Sapna people. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up and summarize in exactly 1 minute. And then if people, whoever is willing to stay on a little bit longer, you have questions, you have comments, please, including Jess, Manjot, Varsha, Shoy, Sadia, Sapna people, and all of you. Just stay on and, for 10 minutes, however long you can stay on, and let's get into that informal session. I think I'm going to go back to the North-South intersectionality in climate activism workshops that we ran. Sapna ran, I ran them. Sapna people, we hosted them together. A lot of you came to it. I'm going to go back to them for a moment because there were certain things raised at the end of it, which kind of touch upon the points we raised today. And those two things are important. In those workshops, we looked at movements in India. We looked at movements in the global South versus North, and we try to understand how we find intersectionality in the narrative and in the work we do. We try to understand the ground from the context of the global South. What we came up with was the need to reframe the narrative, the superpower, renewable energy superpower narrative. We've kind of left it at that. Next week at a Khorana brown bag lunch, we're going to revisit that. This is the other part of the work. Here, we're actually talking about leadership for POC migrant activists. So the two need to come together. And perhaps this is the larger project that we do as a bigger movement team, is think about how narratives can shift, how there can be groups that create themselves and co-generate a narrative, how there's funding and resourcing given, and how there's also cultural literacy, which is not just about our cultural diversity, but understanding the politics and context and all those kinds of things that we have to operate within in South Asia, but also when South Asians kind of talk of the context back in India and Bangladesh, that's what they're talking about. So I think the two projects of Sapna in a way come together, and that's kind of what I take very strongly from this session. The main points are about funding, cultural literacy, creating the space, slowing down, recreating the narrative, and being able to have leadership from the perspective of South Asians and migrant POCs. So that's kind of in a nutshell what kind of I got out of it. I think I would really love to hear people talk. So we're exactly at 1 o'clock, and whoever needs to leave can leave. But if you want to stay on, anybody, can we just come off mute and can share your reflection or your comment? And I'm going to be around for a while. If others can, let's just kind of, use the space for that. And thank you everyone for coming and for the time you've given. And I hope you found it fruitful and productive. Actually, Marcella, why don't you, because you've got
Sorry, everyone. I've just got my video off because I'm a little bit sick. Sorry, everyone. Hello. Marcella from Democracy in Colour, and Ratana's actually left, but this is also for Ratana. I don't know. I think we've talked to you, Sapna, about the climate justice gathering. And I think it came up a little bit about how we just need more spaces like this to come up with our own solutions. And I'm just going to put, and Des is here too, I'm not sure. I'm just going to put a couple of links. We're just having a climate justice gathering in November, and we're asking people of colour and First Nations just to put in a expression of interest to come. We've got limited spaces, but it is also to talk about all of the things that we've talked about here today, just more space to come up with our own solutions. So if you don't mind, can I just put the link to the information pack and the EOI in the chat? It's for First Nations and people of colour only. Is that okay?
Please go for it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruchira, and everyone. This has been a really, really important and beautiful space. Thank you.
We'll also save the chat and send the links. There were some articles shared and lots of really helpful comments. I think that would be great to save. Jess, is there anything else you'd like to add from what you picked up and made notes of from the last session, even the first one?
I have to admit my brain is slowing down a bit, but I just thought, wouldn't it be great if everyone went away from here and just contacted their CEO or their manager or their board and kind of sent them the report and kind of started a conversation within their own organization. That's one thing that everyone could do practically. That's the only thing I have to add.
If you have any comments or reflections, please feel free to, because this is the time. We still have around 34 people around. If there's anything you'd like to share, any reflection, did you find this process helpful? Would you like to do more of it? Any ideas for what you do in the future?
I found it was really helpful. And I know, Ruchira, you've done a whole bunch of workshops in the past, but I would love to see if maybe in the organization that I work for, something similar is possible. There is a very active climate community. So I'd love to chat about how we can do workshops like this in the workshop that you've done in the past, Ruchira, at places where there is an active climate movement or people interested in climate activism.
Sure, definitely, thanks, Deepa.
I'll just speak to it briefly. Just felt like that was just, thanks so much. Really, the report had already given me heaps to think about. I feel like this conversation has been really, really rich, and I just especially appreciate the generosity and work and effort that's gone into getting us all here, and the generosity of what's happened. And I guess a wondering I have is of like, what's the conversation that white people need to take forward, and don't have immediate, like Jess, my brain is a little bit like, well, I'm actually 4 hours into a training after a 2-hour one before this. But if someone wanted to put their hand up to just have a little chat with me afterwards to figure out a bit of a suggestion around how that conversation might happen informally, let me know, and I can come back to folks and I can figure out with Sapna like who it is that we'd get back to say if you're wanting to take part in. Yeah.
I think, thanks, Emma, that's fantastic. In fact, can I just extend that now and say one person from each organization who's here is actually interested to talk to their colleagues, figure out what they want to do, and kind of just write back to us. And again, the invitation also is to Neha, if you're still around, and other kind of POC groups, is how can we collaborate kind of beyond this? Because you guys have been in the space and you've been doing work already. For Sapna, this is a first of its kind of report. We haven't really got out on the ground. So it'll be great to hear back kind of an organizational level response. That's what Jess said, to kind of then think about it. I think that would be fantastic.
Great. Sorry about my barking dog. Excellent. Thanks.
So it looks like it might, as of now, it might. I think everyone's really tired. I woke up at 4 a.m. because I'm in India. I think like this is a wrap right now, but we'll probably definitely continue this in very systematic and structured ways from early next year, and see some of you at the Khana Brown Bag lunch next Thursday at 12. And thanks so much for people who have kind of joined us from overseas, James and Divya. And Divya, safe travels back to the US.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.